Welcome to Brussels Forum 2020. We are pleased to introduce the Vice President for Foreign Policy at the German Marshall Fund, Dr. Ian Lesser.
Good morning and good afternoon from Brussels. Welcome back to Brussels Forum 2020 and its virtual edition, our 15th edition, in fact, of our signature conference. We have been focusing this week on a series of sort of big picture conversations concerning strategic issues where there are stakes on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed globally. Let me at the outset thank once again our partners, our founding partners, Daimler and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our forum partner, Deloitte, and all our associate and supporting and knowledge partners. We're very grateful to all of them. Today, we get to continue our conversation on an issue critical, in fact, to stakes on both sides of the Atlantic, European reform after the pandemic. And we have a very distinguished group to join this conversation today. I'll let our moderator introduce them in a moment. But let me also say a very special word of thanks to the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, our longtime partner in Brussels Forum, and actively participating in this session, as you will see. So we're very grateful to them. And let me welcome also our moderator, Roland Freudenstein, Head of Research and Deputy Director of the Martens Center and a longtime friend of GMF and Brussels Forum. Roland, thank you for doing this. Welcome. Thanks to all of you again for joining. And Roland, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ian, and a warm welcome from myself as well. On behalf also of the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, which is the think tank of the European People's Party. This is I think the 10th time that the Martens Center is cooperating with the Brussels Forum, and therefore it's a special pleasure to have you here, to be here, and to contribute to this important transatlantic event. So, we are talking today about European reform after the pandemic, a transatlantic perspective. And you know, this is in each one of these three terms, European reform, a future of Europe, the pandemic, and transatlantic relations, already would fill a whole evening, as we say in German. But we're going to try to fit those three elements into less than 1 hour. And I think we have the best possible list of speakers or kickoff speakers and discussants that we can imagine. I will start with the first kickoff speaker, Mikuláš Dzurinda, who is currently the president of the Wilfried Martens Center, and he was prime minister and later on foreign minister of Slovakia. And he is the man who brought Slovakia into NATO and the European Union after the dark era of Magyar. Next, we will have Ambassador Philip T. Reeker, who is a career diplomat in the State Department, has filled many ambassadorial posts, and is currently the acting assistant secretary for European and Eurasian affairs in the US State Department in Washington. Third, we are going to hear Constanze Stelzenmüller, who originally comes from journalism, has had ample experience in academia and the think tank world, and is currently senior fellow for foreign policy at the Center on the United States and Europe in the Brookings Institution, also in Washington. And last but not least, we have David O'Sullivan, an Irish national who has a distinguished career in the European institutions, has been ambassador to the United States of the European Union, and before that has filled many high-level posts in the External Action Service, also been Secretary General of the European Commission. So welcome to everyone on this panel with these complex topics to discuss. I would like to now give the floor to Mikuláš Dzurinda with a question of, you know, the starting point for our debate here is going to be the future of Europe after the corona pandemic. How would you characterize that in 3 to 5 minutes? Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. But at the beginning, allow me to thank the German Marshall Fund for continuation with Brussels Forum, which is highly respected, and for the Martens Center, it is a really high privilege to cooperate with the German Marshall Fund. I greet all my friends in the panel, and now I try to respond to your question. When I think what is the most important for Europe in these times of corona crisis, I come to the conclusion that it is the need to maintain or even increase our global competitiveness in all areas, in economy, but also in security and defense, in technology, healthcare, and some other areas. There is also something which should be decreased or reduced, and this is our dependence on China. When I speak about the need to maintain or to increase our competitiveness, I realize that corona crisis has affected everybody. It means there is a great basis to promote reforms, to compete, and to win. This is why I believe that for us Europeans, the new situation creates a very friendly space to promote reforms, changes, and to succeed. To reach this goal, to maintain and to increase our competitiveness, we need to follow 3 R: recovery, reforms, and reunification of Europe. Recovery. Everybody knows there are 2 great instruments in our hands. The first is an unprecedented recovery fund and huge multi-annual financial framework for the years 2021-2027. The decisions have not yet been taken, but the level of unity is pretty high. When it comes to reforms, we need immediate reforms in taxation, in the area of restructuring of our economies, in healthcare, but also in education. But what we need even more is innovation-driven economies. We have to invest much more into education, into technologies, research and development, much more than in the future. And when it comes to the last element, reunification of Europe, this is substantial, this is crucial. Everybody knows that we face a number of dividing lines between the North and the South, between the frugals and spenders, between the West and Visegrad 4, especially when it comes to the rule of law and a liberal democracy principle. So we need also institutional reforms to make equally strong our member states on one side and the EU institutions on the other side. And I am glad that we have been working since 2013 on our imagination, on our plan, how to build Europe. And the current conclusion is that we should build Europe as the authentic federation built on subsidiarity principle. Only strong Europe can be a reliable and relevant partner or ally to the United States. If we want to curb China, we have to go together, hand in hand, Europe and the United States. For the beginning, Roland.
Thank you very much. And let me now turn to Ambassador Phil Reeker and ask you, what was the transatlantic perspective on this ambitious program for reform? And I think it's no secret that the November election in the United States will play a certain role about this. Maybe you can make up scenarios. Floor is yours, Ambassador. We need you to
There, I have unmuted. Sorry, the technological problems today from this corner of the building. Thanks, first of all, for including me. It's really a pleasure to think virtually of being in Brussels and joining the Brussels Forum. This has been a great platform for many years, and delighted that we could do this. As you know, Secretary Pompeo will be joining you tomorrow. The Deputy Secretary will join you on Monday. So it's quite a lineup from us. And so it should be. The discussion about transatlantic relations, particularly in the post-COVID era, is vitally important. I would say that we are keen to see Europe emerge from the pandemic as strong as it was before, and indeed stronger. And so the topic of reforms and opportunities and what we can do together, I think, is very important. You raised rightly, Roland, the upcoming election. That's clearly on everybody's mind. We're in election season here, and well, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to game scenarios. I think what we can count on is that the transatlantic relationship will continue to be the backbone of the West, the concept of the West, the free world, what we do together, built on a foundation of shared values, is going to remain vitally important. And I do think that will continue regardless of the outcome of our elections. And as we watch for changes in evolution, reforms and other aspects in Europe, we keep in mind that it is this foundation of shared values, the commitment to democratic governance, respect for human rights, rule of law, openness, transparency, and the deep economic ties that generate shared prosperity. There's always a lot of talk about where we differ. That makes headlines. But when we work together, what we do actually gets great things done for the world. And I think this year, despite COVID, we can look back on 3/4 of a century of a transatlantic structure, a world order that has really provided us enormous opportunities, things that at the end of World War II probably wouldn't have been imaginable. And that's what we have to continue looking at. We've done a lot actually in the immediate to address the crisis itself. What happens next? Of course, nobody can be sure. We still have to spend a lot of time focused on the epidemiology, the reopening of economies, travel, how we do that right, not knowing all the facts we would like to know about COVID and where we're headed on that. But if you look at what we've committed in terms of COVID relief, global relief efforts together as a transatlantic effort, it's over $35 billion in additional funding, the joint vaccination research projects that we worked on together, and not just government to government, US-EU or US with individual states. It's the broader whole of society approach, which is so important and will continue to be through this. Our economies are most effective and strongest and resilient when we leverage our combined strength, focusing on reducing barriers. We need to continue that. I think as we reopen economies, the focus on trade, on level playing fields is going to be important. The focus on technology is going to be very important. The $3 trillion in trade between the United States and the EU every year is going to mean that resumption of economic activity is vital to the future. And Prime Minister Dzurinda, talked a bit about our competitors, i.e. China, and the alternate vision that they present for the future. I think in terms of reflecting post-COVID, we're already seeing a lot of thinking about China, how we deal with China. And it's important for us on both sides of the Atlantic to renew and strengthen the commitment to common values. I welcome those 3 R's in terms of recovery, resilience, and rights. Those are my 3 R's that we talk about in terms of how we'll look at China together. We've been working with the EU on developing an agenda for a US-EU dialogue on China and consolidating in so many other ways the transatlantic partnership to effectively defend values and institutions. I think we have to focus on that today and right on through November. And wherever we are, this is going to be important next year. As Secretary Pompeo has said, talked about with the Foreign Affairs Council, all of the EU foreign ministers gathered together with High Representative Borrell just over a week ago. It's not a matter of the EU or Europe choosing between the United States and the PRC. That's really the false equivalency. In reality, it's what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to force on all of us. And it really means we have to take a strong look and reaffirm our commitment to the international rules-based order, restore reciprocity and balance in our relationship with each other, but also how we approach Beijing. And I think things like disinformation make that very clear to us, the challenges we have there from China, but also from Russia and other actors. We need to be able to set aside differences. We do that well. We have differences. Let's not paper over that. Differences in approach, differences in tactics, but our broad strategy is about working together and strengthening the relationship. So reinvesting in that economic relationship and international financial and trade institutions, I think, is going to be critical, and that'll help stimulate the necessary economic recovery. Huge amounts of money pumped into the systems on both sides of the Atlantic. Let's take an opportunity to do this. Look at, as Prime Minister Dzurinda said, technology, innovation. That's going to be critical. And that happens and needs to be the focus regardless of what happens in our elections in November.
Thank you so much. I would just have this one follow-up question, and excuse me for being a little bit provocative. So if the US wants to decouple from China and Europe says we can't, what are we going to do? It's very blunt, but let's discuss that question up front.
Look, I don't think it's really about decoupling. It's about thinking in terms of how we approach China. And even this week, President Trump has made that clear. The Secretary came back shortly after his engagement with the Foreign Affairs Council. He met with Chinese counterparts, the boss of his Chinese counterpart in Hawaii, to discuss this, making clear to China where we have certain interests, and making clear as a transatlantic community that we're not going to choose our transatlantic relationship versus China. That's not really the question. That's what China is trying to do, trying to divide, make wedges, divide us, take advantage of differences, use disinformation to pump that. It's about together talking through how we approach China, where we establish and remind China also of the rules, intellectual property protection as we innovate, not allowing them to steal that, as has been the past practice. Fair playing fields, resilience. We need to rethink our supply chains. COVID has taught us about that to make us resilient in the future. And I think that's where our dialogue that we're looking at and developing will be a very useful tool between Washington and Brussels.
Thanks very much. Let me now turn this over to Constanze and ask you, what is your take, both on the general question of the future of Europe and the transatlantic perspective, but also maybe a little bit about possible future dialogue on China?
All right. Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this distinguished panel. This is a big topic, and I think since we've been asked to be brief, rightly so, I'm going to focus on one point rather than covering the entire waterfront, if I may. And it's I want to emphasize something that this pandemic has, in my view, highlighted, which is the issue of governance and trust, state capacity, institutional capacity, and in our case, the EU's capacity. And I think that the pandemic has really turned out to be a multi-crisis of governance across the board in authoritarian countries, in international institutions. We've seen the WHO struggling with Chinese influence, but we have also seen Western democracies struggling with governance issues as well. And I would include in that my own country, Germany, which is always said to have had such a wonderful pandemic. I would say that that is partially true, but we've also shown some significant weaknesses. And again, because I want to be brief here, I think that if this crisis has shown anything to us, it is that Western democracies have unique vulnerabilities in such moments. And if I were to editorialize, I would say it has become very clear that we have taken the effectiveness, in fact, the basic functioning, and the legitimacy of our democratic ordering systems in the West for granted. And we are now being shown by this pandemic that that was a mistake. So I think that Mikuláš Dzurinda was right to say that we need to look at the ordering of our nation states, our constitutional orders, the functioning of our institutions, to make sure that they survive the next wave or the next pandemic, which is sure to come. And I'll stop there. Roland, are you still there?
I'm there. Okay, thanks very much. That was really brief. That triggers a follow-up. How are we going to make our constitutions, make our governance more resilient while still remaining liberal democracies? Give us one or two examples where you would like governments to continue working.
Well, I think that there is a conversation to be had within Europe and between Europe and the United States and other Western style democracies about what has worked and what has not. And I think if one thing that's become clear is that very centralized democracies have a hard time in handling this kind of a problem, because handling a pandemic really requires a functioning chain of not just of command, but of communication and trust between central governments and local governments and the citizens to whom they are applied. It also requires a great deal of communication and coordination between governments and business. We're seeing this now, for example, with the fights around vaccines. We're seeing it with the fights around the closing and reopening of businesses that are considered essential, or that conversely turn out to be super spreader hotspots, like the 2 meat packing processing plants in Germany that have just occasioned a regional lockdown again in North Rhine-Westphalia. We're seeing it in connection with the debates about technological biosurveillance and the introduction of so-called corona apps, contact tracing apps. I think that we're seeing governments in France and Britain and Sweden struggling with these things. I think for different reasons. I think in France and in Britain, we've seen that extreme centralization around the central government is a problem, because local governments, regional institutions are left somewhat adrift. And we're also seeing in Sweden, I think, shall we say, a lack of consciousness, of a lack of resolve on the part of government that has, I don't want to be brutal here, but that has led to a genuinely unique situation in Europe, with a death rate and neighboring countries closing their borders to Sweden that is truly extraordinary. And I think that these are going to be difficult conversations, because they've never been part of the intragovernmental relationships that we've had. Health provision, public health, has been very much a nation state and a local government prerogative. But I think if we, given the degree of your economic and labor market integration that we have in Europe, one country's vulnerability is the vulnerability of its neighboring countries and of the rest of Europe.
Thanks, Constanze. So this is the eminent question of subsidiarity versus centralization. This is also the question of best practice among the member states. And of course, ultimately, of the whole construction of Europe, is it what kind of federal construct could or should it be? All right, let me now turn over to David O'Sullivan. How do you see this debate? And then we're actually going to take some questions from the Q&A from the audience. David, the floor is yours.
Yes, well, Constanze has hit a very high standard of brevity, so I'm struggling to see how I can compress my remarks, because it's a very broad topic. Let me pick up where Constanze left off, because that was going to be my opening remark, is to say that perhaps the greatest feature of this pandemic has been the return of the nation state, the primacy of the nation state as the source of kind of protection and national solidarity. But at the same time, I would say it's not even the nation state, it is more the local. And so you have seen, for example, in the UK, where it's actually not just London, it's Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales are actually following different practices to those of England. In the US, you saw that it was states and cities that were quickly the ones who were mobilizing to try and react. So I think indeed we have had an interesting debate, which Constanze has touched on, about how our countries, our states, our polities are organized, and what is the optimum level at which you address problems. And on one level, there has been a sort of cocooning effect of a pandemic like this, because public health is, generally speaking, not only a nation state context, but very often a locally devolved context in federal states. But at the same time, we've seen very clearly that a local response is not self-sufficient, that you cannot isolate yourself from what happens in your neighboring regions, in your neighboring countries. And whereas there was some criticism, I think, of the European Union in the beginning that it was slow to react, which was normal because the European Union has no competence or little competence in public health. It was a purely national competence. I think people are suddenly seeing actually the EU is an indispensable element also of the solution, even if you accept the primacy of the national or the local. And that is where, for example, the work of the Commission, which is sometimes rather boring, but in keeping supply chains going at frontiers, when frontiers were closed for very good public health reasons, but it was vital to keep the supply chains, to keep the freight and the trucks moving through those supply chains. So the Green Lane initiative was a very quick initiative taken by the Commission to make sure that, in fact, countries could continue to source their necessary supplies for their population. And equally, of course, we're now seeing that on an economic level, the EU is going to be indispensable in shaping the recovery. On the transatlantic dimension and China, I mean, just two comments, if I may. I could subscribe almost entirely to the words of Ambassador Reeker. He'll forgive me for remarking that I don't think those are words always practiced by this administration. He can't possibly comment, I understand. But I think that is, you know, I was struck by the rules-based order. Well, what about the WTO? What about the International Criminal Court? What about the WHO? But let's be honest about that there is not a common agreement across the Atlantic today on a number of these issues. This happens, and we have fundamental shared values which unite us more than divide us. So I'm sure over time we can work on it. But I think the key, if I may say so respectfully, Ambassador, is for the US to understand that in order to pursue whatever agenda it has, it needs allies. And in order to do that, you have to be willing to listen to your allies. We cannot have a debate about China, which does not also take into account the European view of China and how we go forward in engaging with China at the same time as confronting them on the issues about which we disagree, which requires a shared agenda, which is not simply, forgive me, a United States agenda to which the EU then, or the member states, or the EU and the member states sign up and say, yes, absolutely, we're on board with whatever it is you want to do. And that's the difficulty, frankly, of how we build a common agenda when we don't necessarily have a common vision of the problem or of the best way to address it. That's the challenge. I don't think we're going to do a lot between now and November, to be very honest. But whatever the outcome in November, I hope that we can then get back to the table and try to figure out how we can do a better job at having a more common appreciation of these issues than has been the case until now. Sorry, that's just two kind of separate thoughts on Europe, the COVID, and then the transatlantic relations.
Thank you very much. I would now like to bring up the two questions from the audience that we already have. The first one concerns the construction of Europe. Aren't we on the way to a European federal state? And isn't actually the Corona pandemic accelerating this, where we are more willing to share sovereignty than before? So who would like to take that question? I saw Constanze shaking her head very charmingly. Could you elaborate, Constanze?
I think that's not factually correct. Let's start with the famous so-called Hamiltonian moment, the Germans doing a turnaround on a European recovery program. This is a one-off. It's not a Hamiltonian moment. The EU is not getting the power to tax. It is not getting a permanent power to issue bonds in Europe's name. It is, however, a truly historic commitment on the part of the Germans and a genuine historic turnaround, particularly in the part of Angela Merkel's party. I don't think that this is a moment for a renewal of super-federalism. I could see maybe that there would be advances in integration on certain points where we think that would simply help solve problems, particularly in managing the Eurozone. But I agree with David that this moment has shown the importance, the resilience and the democratic value of the nation state. I think the paradox that is so difficult for people to wrap their heads around is that this isn't necessarily a binary where sort of super-federalism or national sovereignty exclude each other. The European reality already, and for the past decades, has been the coexistence and the deep integration of functioning nation states and federalizing institutions. It works, and frankly, it's not. I mean, it's constitutionally different from the United States, but not that different. And sometimes one gets the impression that the United States currently are defederalizing a little bit. You may be going in the direction of Europe, but I mean, that's a semi-joke. But I think if we have learned anything here is that I think we're going to be continuing with a mixture of nation state competences, intergovernmental coordination of all the really serious issues, and federalizing where we think that is simply the best solution for solving problems. But Eastern states in particular, as we know, are very resistant to this. And I don't see a big push towards this politically, even in some of the more integration-happy Western states.
Thank you, Constanze. I saw Mikuláš Dzurinda. You would like to come in?
Yes, Madame Constanze used 2 or 3 times expression super federalism. I wouldn't use such an expression. And the response on the question put from the auditorium depends on our picture. What do we think the real federalization or federalism means? I remember time of Czechoslovakia. Formerly, we were a federal state. In reality, it was huge centralization. I would like to talk or to put to your observation expression subsidiarity. If we go building Europe from bottom to up, it would be different. And the best method how to understand each other is a real example. Look, do we need in Europe to speak with one voice in the field of foreign policy and security or not? I wouldn't speak that there is a momentum, Hamilton example or something like that. Federalization cannot be built on a momentum, but I believe in a process. I remember when I started my career in 1991. In these days, the situation is completely different. If we want to be able to respond to regional challenges, the Middle East issues, or immigration from Africa to Europe, if we want to become a really acceptable, reliable partner of the United States, it is impossible to look for consensus in foreign policy issues on everyday basis. We need to decide not to talk and to talk forever. So I believe that after this bold decision to issue for the first time in our history common bonds, that the next step will be, for instance, the change of our decision-making in the field of foreign policy from consensus to majority vote. By the way, Madame Merkel, I know the lady for many, many years. She started talking about the need to follow this authentic federal process.
Thank you very much. I would like to, we still have a couple of other questions, but on this question of majority voting as a possible means to make the EU a stronger actor, a more united actor in foreign policy, I would like to turn this to David O'Sullivan and then maybe to Ambassador Reeker. David?
May I just say, Roland, thank you, that I agree entirely with what Constanze said in reply to the very first question. I mean, I think it's a false binary to say that it's either the nation state or a fully federal Europe. It's a continuum, and we move along that continuum in function of the needs of our nations and our people. We may well have a slight increase in Europe as a result of this pandemic. For example, I think one of the things that people will look for in due course is a more coordinated crisis response mechanism at the level of the EU, so that we can better manage these kind of situations than we were able to do in this case. But I don't think there's going to be a sudden light switch moment where one day we're a continent of nation states and the next day we're the United States of Europe. It's never going to happen that way. On qualified majority voting, look, the treaties foresee a move to qualified majority voting in three areas, which has to be decided by unanimity, but it mainly involves sanctions, the issue of declarations, and the launching of military missions. I think it's self-evident that we should do that. I don't think when you want to make a declaration that one member state should be allowed to block it. I think if you want to launch a mission, which member states have to decide whether they participate or not anyway, why not let that be decided by qualified majority? And frankly, on sanctions, it's a bit more complicated, but I think there's a strong logic there also for saying we should proceed by qualified majority. But respectfully, I think it would be an illusion to imagine that we can implement a common foreign policy simply by saying we decided by qualified majority. If member states who don't agree then choose actively to oppose that, to speak against it, we undermine the whole purpose. So there are things we can do to facilitate the decision-making process. Myself, I would almost prefer what we used to call in the jargon constructive abstentionism rather than qualified majority, where a country says, yes, I don't agree, I have a veto right, but I'm not going to use it because I understand the rest of you want to go ahead and I shouldn't block you. It's much more that we can develop rather than the blunt instrument of saying qualified majority. We saw in the migration debate and the quotas for reallocation of migrants, where I had full sympathy with the countries who wanted to see that when we imposed the qualified majority, in the end, we weren't able to impose it. It didn't happen. We decided a law which was actually not implemented. So I think we need to be very cautious only to use qualified majority in situations where it will meaningfully lead to a change and be accepted as leading to a change.
Thank you. Phil, would you like to say a word? I mean, how desperate is the US to get Europe as a unified actor, to have one phone number to call in Europe?
I'm not sure if I'm on mute. Can you hear me? Good. No, thanks for that. This is a great discussion, and I wouldn't want to comment too specifically on what the European Union should do, how it should deal with things like qualified majority voting. Our mission, Ambassador Gidwitz and others watch these things closely. What I really appreciate is the discussion, and I think it underscores an important point I'd like to stress. There really is an opportunity brought by this pandemic, brought by this crisis, as usually there is, to make some changes, to at least consider them, and it underscores the importance of education. I think what I'm hearing from you, Europeans, and what I'm observing is now is a moment to help Europeans broadly across all the member states understand better what the European Union is about. What is Brussels? What is this this mythical idea? Where does it function? Where does it not? How does the European experiment operate? And so there is an opportunity there, and you can use that also to help educate others around the world about the EU and how it works. Similarly, it's an opportunity for Americans to be educated more. As you've commented, we've noted the difference between what is at a federal capacity, where are the states or localities and communities more competent and have the authorities. You've mentioned already our upcoming elections in November. There'll be a focus, of course, on the states, the electoral college, and how all that works. So a chance to really educate and understand better. And that gets to the point of multilateral institutions as well. I understand David's comments. Secretary Pompeo said the other day, we stand firmly behind and have been the creators or partially responsible for so many of the multilateral institutions around the world. What we have to constantly look at is, are they accomplishing what they were created to do? And where have they fallen off? Obviously, with the WHO, we've discovered they have failed in many ways, made evident by the pandemic now. How do we fix that? How do we change that? How do we recreate as needed these institutions? Again, a sort of broad educational opportunity brought about by the pandemic. We look forward to having these conversations with the European Union, and of course with individual member states as well. But Secretary Pompeo has made a great effort over the last certainly 9 months since the new leadership was chosen for the EU to reach out. Of course, our direct engagement and travel has been curtailed for a number of months now, but we look forward to getting that started again. The dialogue that we want to have with the EU on China is exactly that, a dialogue. And we have ideas about the broad agenda. I think we can get agreement on the areas that we need to look at in terms of recovery, in terms of resilience, in terms of human rights, the disinformation issue, in terms of security. We've had discussions on some of those things in issues like the 5G question that we've raised. I think there's better awareness about that now and what that means. But certainly that'll have to be developed bilaterally. And as has been mentioned by a number of the other panelists, these aren't binary issues by any means. They're shades of gray. We'll look at that, but the best way to do that is through a dialogue. And I think even this week we're trying to look at how we'll move forward on that dialogue, even in the absence of the ability yet to come together in person.
Thank you so much. I'd like to bring in two more points that came up in the Q&A. One is, what's the impact of the German election? We've been talking about the US election all the time, but what about the German election next year? And I think this is tailor-made for you, Constanze. And the other question is about the green development. How is that going to look like after the pandemic? Has it been completely eclipsed by the pandemic, or will we return to some maybe also transatlantic differences over climate policies also in a multilateral context? And those questions, please go to the other speakers. So Constanze, you're first.
Well, the Chancellor has made it very clear that she has absolutely no intention of running for a fifth term, although apparently there are people who would like her to. I have to say, I understand the woman. She must have the stamina of a rhinoceros. But in fact, that reminds me, I once asked one of her staffers what it was like to work for her, and he said, you know, it's like working next to a nuclear power plant. It runs and runs and runs. But while this pandemic has clearly given her something of an upturn and has given her suddenly political capital, bandwidth to do things that previously everybody thought had become impossible for her because she was in a Götterdämmerung lame duck period of her tenure. It's clear that in the fall of next year, we will have German elections. The leadership race is currently wide open. None of the candidates that are official have particularly distinguished themselves, it has to be said. And so I think it's very clear for this government, and that's not just for the Chancellor, but also for her social democratic partners, that if they want to leave a mark, if they want to be able to look back on this historic multi-crisis, then the moment to act is now. And I think it would be good if European neighbors and friends understood this.
Thank you so much, Constanze. I mean, I'd love to follow up on this, but we're running out of time here. So let me turn to Ambassador Reeker and David O'Sullivan, maybe with the green question here.
Sure. I think it's a perfect time. I mean, we've all seen, in fact, the results, bluer skies of decreased carbon emissions. It's a good time to remember what country has actually been most successful in reducing carbon emissions through use of technology. We talked about innovation is going to be critical on both sides of the Atlantic and around the world to our economic recovery. It's a great opportunity. And I think when we keep in mind environmental and green concepts as well, innovation and working that into our economic models, there is a super opportunity here. It also reminds us, as we talk about China, in terms of environmental impact, the idea of China as a developing country. Here's a country that's buying up infrastructure, including across Europe, predatory lending practices. That's not a developing country. And that's why the approach to certain things like environmental standards has to be looked at, I think, in a new way. And we have an opportunity to do that. I'm sure in our transatlantic conversation on restarting our economies, on level playing field, on trade, we will have an opportunity to include those factors, and let's make the most of that.
Thank you so much. David, is there any point where you would like to comment?
Well, just on the green issue, I mean, I think this is going to be a driving force of policy in Europe in the next 4 or 5 years. I think the Commission was right to identify this as a kind of federating theme, which then runs through a lot of other stuff, such as the circular economy, the better use of digitization and so forth. And I think this is going to be a transformative moment. And I think to a certain extent, the pandemic with the economic downturn You would think that might slow things down. I actually think the alternative option is the better, which is to accelerate and to move more quickly towards the next phase of economic development, which is clearly green technologies, cleaner technologies, innovation, as Ambassador Reeker said. I think the policies of this administration in the US, Ambassador, forgive me, have not been very supportive in some of this. I think I take your point about China, but I do think that the Paris Climate Accord is the only possible basis for global progress on this issue. And I think we need the US back on board in that at some point. So I think that is certainly a conversation we will have, but I am very encouraged by what I saw in the United States, which was across the states, in the cities, a huge recognition of the importance of this agenda and a willingness to do things about it at the state and at the city level in the US. So I don't think there may be some fairly deep policy divergences between the Europeans and this administration on this issue. I don't think there is such a deep divide actually across the Atlantic in terms of public opinion and the mood of industry and even NGOs.
Thank you so much. I would love to continue this, but we're really running out of time. There are also more very intelligent questions, but I've been told that we need to finish on time. So let me just try to wrap it up here with maybe 3 points that were running through this debate over the last hour. The corona pandemic has accelerated and intensified challenges and dilemmas that we face jointly, America and Europe face jointly. And we will have to actually find common answers. The second point is that this particularly concerns the relationship with China, and we've heard the need for a joint transatlantic approach to dialogue with China and to raising also uncomfortable questions that have intensified recently. And the last point is that all this needs to be done on the basis of shared values. And indeed, as Phil Reeker said, we tend to look at the transatlantic differences more than at the values and the things that we have in common. We need to emphasize the latter much more, whatever happens in the November election. So thank you all very much. It's been a lively debate. We could have continued this for hours, but we have to finish now. Thank you so much, and thanks to the German Marshall Fund for having us, the Martens Center. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks all.